Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back after a short break. We've seen a video presentation of our partner, the city of Prague, the wonderful capital of the Czech Republic, where we are having the Prague European Summit. And now we can go on with our next panel. In the previous one, we focused on the societal fragmentation brought by the COVID pandemics. Now we're going to focus on the economical questions, because the pandemics has hit not only the different states of the EU differently, but also different economical sectors have been hit quite differently. While some haven't been touched by the pandemics at all, nearly, some have been hit really hard, and some have even achieved an unprecedented growth. How do we make the situation just, fair, and how do we make sure that no one is left behind? Those are some of the questions that I believe are going to be answered by the panelists from the next panel. And the moderator of the panel is Mr. Ilya Robanis, the Managing Director of Brussels Morning. Ilya, I give the floor to you. I'm looking forward for hearing the answers.
Thank you on behalf of Brussels Morning for the invitation and the opportunity to host such an interesting panel, which in many ways continues from the previous discussion. We have the premise of this panel is to discuss, broadly speaking, inequality, and often inequality starts with a reflection on GDP growth, or the pie that is to be shared. I think we are coming to the limits of how fruitful is a discussion on GDP alone when discussing inequality, which predated the pandemic crisis and will probably outlast it. It's the second major economic crisis we've had in a very short period. And as anyone who covers European politics finds out, media platforms have a similar problem with politicians who are in Brussels, members of European Parliament. It's hard to engage national audiences in European discussions, because most people experience their politics through a national sphere. But if anyone can help in this discussion, I think this panel can. All people who have both policy development and academic experience. And the combination is, I think, necessary. I'd like to welcome Mrs. Maria de Merzis, Deputy Director of Bruegel. Hello. And I'm glad to say also, it's nice to have women speaking in panels on the economy. It's not as many as there should be. And also it's interesting that in this second crisis we're looking to leading figures in women to lead the economic recovery. Mr. Laszlo Andor, Secretary General for the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. Excuse me, a little more about Ms. de Merzis. Besides being the Deputy Director of Bruegel, she has worked for the European Commission. She taught at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and Strathclyde in the UK, and also worked for the Dutch Central Bank. So an all-around experience. Mr. Laszlo Andor, Secretary General for the Foundation of European Progressive Studies, also has a strong academic background with the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, among other things, Sciences Po in Paris, and has worked for various think tanks, including the European Policy Center, RAND, Europe, Friends of Europe, and so on. And now, I'd also like to welcome a Senior Research Officer for the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies, Mr. Dr. Ian?
Close.
Yes?
Yes.
Close?
Yes, close.
Close enough. Drea, I'm sorry, I've been puzzling over this for a few days. Interestingly, an expert on middle class by way of research, if I'm not mistaken. And holds a PhD in economic history from the University College Cork. And he's a postdoctoral research fellow at the School of Business at Trinity College Dublin. And the way I would like to organize the discussion today is broadly in two rounds. The first would be to ask for a brief comment on what is relevant, what are the relevant factors of inequality that we should be discussing at this point, before going to a second, let's say, round on what are the specific factors of policy that should guide us out of the current crisis. So, without further ado, shall we start with Dr. Demerzis?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Ilya, for your introduction, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I'm really sorry I cannot be with you in Prague today. I would have liked that, but hopefully next year it will be easier to travel. If I may start with one of the points you raised, Ilya, in your introduction on GDP as a relevant factor for measuring growth, measuring prosperity, measuring welfare. I think this is really a very interesting discussion. I'm not sure we should have it today because it is a very, very big discussion. Nevertheless, I think it is an important thing to reflect upon, in particular, as we are interested not only in good outcomes, but also in sustainable outcomes. And I say this today, this afternoon, we are going to hear about the new package the European Commission is going to launch on how we are approaching our climate ambitions. And I think, the issue of sustainability is just as important as it is in terms of good outcomes. Now, to your question, which is, what types of things we need to look at when it comes down to inequality. You're quite right in saying that the pandemic has not hit everyone the same way, and not just on the health aspects, but also the economic aspects. The ability to deal with the economic consequences of the pandemic have been in direct, I should say, proportional link to how ready countries were when we entered the pandemic. You see that those that had the fiscal power to really put money in the economy did with better consequences than those that were less prepared. Nevertheless, I think in the EU, we are fortunate enough to have the capacity to react. And we did react both at the national level and at the supranational level, namely the EU level, very quickly and effectively with huge firepower. So I think that's an important thing. Nevertheless, we really see divergences, and that comes down to your questions. If you look at the simple macro numbers, we recently did an exercise in which we calculated the cumulative GDP growth from 2019 to 2023, so that includes forecasts, and we see huge differences in the way that countries will be able to manage in terms of welfare these last 5 years. We have countries that are even in negative territory, in a cumulative growth in the last 5 years, and we have countries that are almost in double-digit numbers. So there are huge differences here, which means that the ability to cope with the pandemic has not been even. So, that's a very important thing. And beyond that, of course, there is what you said also in your introduction earlier, the sectorial differences. We had sectors like tourism and entertainment that really took a very big hit during the pandemic, airlines, another sector. And we had sectors like pharmaceuticals and indeed digital sectors that actually thrived through the pandemic. So we are seeing a very different reaction to the pandemic. And again, when it comes to income strata, we also seen that those that were on the lower income of the distribution of the income distribution have also been hit harder than those who are both richer and more educated. And I think that is something that as we move out slowly of the pandemic, we need to target. So our policies need to be targeted towards helping those that were hit the hardest and not having measures that are, as they have been in the past year, non-discriminatory. Perhaps we can come back in the second part of the discussion when we talk about policy measures. Thank you.
Right. So I think the discussion I keep from this brief statement, we need to pay attention to divergence between countries, sectors, but what about, and that we had a firepower, adequate response front-ended in this crisis that might not have been the same in the previous crisis. And looking at that, I'd like to go to Mr. Andor. I wanted to a small comment on exactly on or what you feel has been the macroeconomic. What are the macroeconomic elements that you feel we should be looking at as we are undergoing this crisis?
Yes, I would start with unemployment, which is one of the most sensitive macroeconomic indicators. And I would highlight that last year in 2020, in my view, the European Union performed better than in the previous crisis in terms of mitigating the rise of unemployment as a result of the recession. This relative success is also striking in transatlantic comparison, because after the first wave of the pandemic, by the end of last summer, there was about a 4 percentage point difference between Europe and the United States of America, primarily because Europe was relatively successful in mitigating the risk of unemployment through short-time work arrangements, which was also first time ever in economic history coordinated by the European Union. And not only coordinated, but also supported by the new instrument, which was invented in 2 weeks in the spring period, and offering about 100 billion euros loans to the member states who are ready to operate through these so-called Kurzarbeit schemes. So this was really an unprecedented policy response, relatively successful, and also relevant for inequality, because the rapidly rising unemployment, if it happens, is one of the main drivers in a recession period of income inequality. That happened in the past crisis, in the Eurozone crisis, when countries like Spain, Greece, but also Italy, where income inequality had already been relatively high, and these countries experienced a rapid rise of unemployment. It was also driving up further income inequalities. And this, at least, has been mitigated. Not completely eliminated at this time, but relatively speaking, mitigated in the first phases of the recession. And obviously, this is not going to solve the problem for a long term. But new policies are needed from this point of view at the European level. I think it's very important to pay attention to the legislative initiative to coordinate minimum wages. Mm-hmm. Because if the EU could establish an effective wage floor mm-hmm. In all countries and in all sectors, somehow defining the desired level of the minimum wage in comparison with the median wage, mm-hmm. That would be already one significant barrier for further rise of income inequalities.
I think you're giving me a good bridge. The crisis of inequality on wages often reflects on the middle class, and a crisis of the middle class is a crisis of democracy. But how can you coordinate minimum wages without coordinating taxation, which I think gives me a good pass to an Irish friend of ours to discuss both the middle class and taxation coordination. These two may be linked together in terms of policy, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely. And I think what the pandemic has shown, I think it was raised in the previous panel, was that regardless of GDP levels, or actually even unemployment rates, there's a real sense that societies are even weaker than ever before. We had the Great Recession, starting in 2007. Now we've had the pandemic, and certainly, our impression as we deal with our member foundations across Europe, the feeling in the middle classes is that they have to kind of run faster and faster just to stand still. Mm-hmm. And certainly there is this perception that, and it's also a perception that's increasingly been felt not just in Western Europe, but across the continent, that younger people today will find it very difficult to achieve the standard of living or the wealth accumulation that their parents did, particularly in Western Europe. So I think the real question for us is actually, economic history is pretty clear that there should be a very significant economic bounce back from the pandemic. Whenever we can finally, get these variants under control, reopen international travel fully, etc., that there will be a significant economic bounce back. But I think the challenge for policymakers is how do we ensure that this recovery is sustainable, that we can, kind of stream it out to the long term, not just have a very short post-pandemic boom, but actually bring it into the long term. And the other thing is how we can use this economic recovery to lessen inequalities, which comes back to the previous point. And in this regard, I would be very worried. I think that sometimes policymakers can lose sight of the things which are driving people on the street. Because I'm pretty sure if you went out onto the street of Prague today and you went out Dublin, Brussels, any capital city across the EU, one of the key factors will be house prices. There is no doubt that we are witnessing very worrying developments in house prices across the EU. Just to give kind of a context to that, because it's a very easy thing to say, Eurostat just put out some new statistics which show that house prices have increased by at least 60% in the last decade in countries as diverse as Austria, Estonia, Luxembourg, here in Czechia, and also in Germany. And that is vastly outstripping the increase in real wages. Mm-hmm. So you have this situation where house prices are increasing much quicker than real wages, and basically that's widening the gap. It's widening the gap between people who have assets, who can use very cheap money to finance more assets, and between those people and young people in their 20s and 30s and young families. Unfortunately, what I think is that the pandemic is coming on top of a decade of super low interest rates. I think that possibly it is an issue that is understood in the ECB, but they're a little bit behind the curve in introducing proper measures. I'll give you an example. The inflation, the harmonized price index that the ECB uses to calculate inflation takes no account of owner-occupied housing. Mm-hmm. So, some economists, I worked forgive my obsession with property, but I worked as a property economist for many years. But I can tell you that many colleagues are telling me in the private sector that Eurozone inflation is already over 2% if you factor in housing. I know that housing prices in the Netherlands rose by 13% in 1 year. In the US, new house prices, medium level, rose by 24%. This is a huge problem if it continues. It will widen the gap, and it will force younger people, younger families, to move towards the political extremes, because they will seek parties that promise to give solutions to these problems. That's it.
Yes, when change can't be managed, you go for whoever is different rather than not necessarily for whoever makes a difference. Yeah. But to look forward in terms of policy, Mr. Mertis, you have worked both for a central bank and for the European Commission. And I think in the last crisis, it is fair to say that when we're looking for EU leadership, we were looking at the European Central Bank. This time around, we can also look at the Commission. There's been bold initiative. But can this actually touch the man and woman in the street in the sense of how do I address the fact that my children are not likely to be able to buy a house of their own? How do we look forward while we are also managing this crisis? What's your take on that? Pardon? Is there a, sorry, there is a sound issue, I believe.
Anemut.
Just a second. There's a, hello?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now yes.
Yeah. Yes, sorry, I think my mic was off. You raised a very important question, but let me just upfront say that the policies that have been taken in the past year have really touched the man on the street. This was a health crisis. Money was thrown to the problem of health, and that made a difference. It's important to realize that. On the economic side, if we hadn't had the pandemic program of the European Central Bank, we wouldn't have been able, for a number of countries, and that includes my own Greece, wouldn't be able to go to the markets and borrow and finance that process. So yes, it has affected the ability of the countries to react, and therefore the man on the street has really seen a difference. And the counterfactual is that if we hadn't had it, really the world would look quite different today. I think that's important. Now, on the housing prices, I share the sentiment, your sentiment on this. That's why I was also very happy that in the recent revision of the European Central Bank strategy, house prices will actually come into the bundle of prices, the basket of prices that the European Central Bank will be looking at. So this is good news for exactly the reasons that Ewan raised in his introductory remarks. So that's very important. I wanted to perhaps modify the argument a little bit. The recent surge on house prices that we see is, of course, adding up to the increasing prices that we've seen in the previous decade. So that much, of course, is an issue. But I think there are factors that feeding into house price increases today that may not necessarily be here to stay. They may be just temporary things. There is an increase in demand for housing that is due simply to the shutdown. We have increased, the middle class has really seen an increase in their savings, and they're looking to buy bigger houses. So that component is actually quite a big component in the current, and by current I mean the last year increase in prices that we've seen. Very interesting research is coming out of the Central Bank of Denmark that is looking at this issue, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. So when this recent surge has stopped, how much of an increase in prices do we still see? Now, that said, the numbers also that you quoted were actually important. The Dutch numbers in particular are really quite big. There are accelerating factors in the context of the Netherlands that are important here, and they don't hold for other countries. However, I think it's important to look at housing very carefully and use regulation in whichever way we can to affect that. All of this is done in the context of low interest rates, and that is not something, in my view, that will change very fast, because there are good reasons for that. So on that front, I think that is not going to change. Perhaps in my next round, I can say something about the role of the Next Generation EU Fund in times of leveling the playing field in the way that countries will be able to deal with the post-pandemic effects.
Right. Continuing along macroeconomic thinking, there seems to be a consensus that income support was extremely important in this crisis. One wonders why it was less important in the previous one. And even Friedman talked about helicopter money that is now being tried for. We are not channeling money to markets, to channel it to people, but we're doing it more directly this time around. So I wanted a comment by Laszlo on should this be a trajectory we should continue following, perhaps?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what we have heard is that now we are in a phase when the side effects of the interventions that took place last year are becoming very serious. And that's why, obviously, with some of the tools that have been used, you have to start thinking about how to phase them out. Mm-hmm. In case of some other tools, perhaps, what I mentioned, I believe, is a good example, the SURE instrument. You can say, okay, let's stabilize this, and to ensure that if the next crisis comes, we don't need to improvise, but there is already a safety net existing. But I think we would agree that 1 year ago there was practically no alternative to fiscal and monetary relaxation and expansionary response to the crisis. But now we need to see how the negative side effects can be minimized. And there's probably a long list of side effects. The impact on housing prices was mentioned, which probably has a different effect in different countries, depending on what model certain countries have. In some countries, like the UK or Hungary, house ownership is very high, so there's probably a greater effect. In countries like Germany, where it's more kind of typical to rent an apartment, probably these effects are more modest. So there is certainly a diversity of situations in the European Union. But what I think we also saw in the last 1 year is the very, very uneven health capacities, because even if we speak about macroeconomics now, we are dealing with an essentially health crisis, which is also an incredible stress test of the healthcare systems. And then it also exposed the very uneven level of investment, the very uneven capacities of the health systems across the European Union. I would dare to say that there is probably an East-West divide emerging in this context, not simply because of the state of technology and physical investment, but primarily because of the migration of health staff, doctors as well as nurses. And this is also something which would require some kind of coordination response under the umbrella of the health union. Now it's very trendy to speak about a health union, but if it doesn't address these great imbalances or deepening imbalances in the EU in terms of the capacity, then it will have a limited value.
Right. And I suppose this calls for, is it altruism that the EU develops by facing different kinds of crises? Perhaps even states do the same. But the question is, if, and turning to Mr. Drea, is what actually are the crises we recognized and are facing right now? So health seems to be new in the agenda. Housing is beginning to be something we recognize and measure and do something about. Is there anything else as a positive legacy of what we are going through, in your view?
Yeah, I think obviously health is as a result of the nature of the pandemic. But of course, at its core at the moment, health remains a member state prerogative. So we'll have to see how that develops in the future. I think the big challenge or the big opportunity which the EU has identified and which the Commission has put forward specific proposals on is obviously how to transition in terms to meet the climate challenge. And I think that's kind of, I suppose, one of the big underlying pillars of the European Recovery Fund, is that how do we enable a transition to a more lower carbon, low emission world. And I think that's going to be, It's going to be the issue that defines probably EU policy making over the next 2 to 3 decades. We've already seen it come up as a big issue in European summits over the summer, particularly in how to offset some of the issues facing particularly countries in Central and Eastern Europe that are further away to these climate goals than many in Western Europe. I think though, and I think it was actually raised in the previous panel to this, is do we view this kind of post-pandemic environment as a threat or an opportunity? Because if we view it as a threat, EU policymakers have a habit of reverting back to old established norms, be it on fiscal rules, be it on attitudes to the internal market, lots of things. But if we view this post-pandemic environment as an opportunity to further develop, then I think we have significant potential for change. I'm talking about, like, we need to update rules for work for the digital age. There's going to be huge sectors in the economy now that will facilitate their workers at least working in a hybrid model, a couple of days a week from home. What does that mean for social security systems? What does that mean for unemployment benefits? We've got to seriously look at, low paid and precarious employment in the gig economy. We've got to ensure that these people are brought into social security nets. It's all great to talk about, flexibility and that this is the new economy, which is all true. But I think the pandemic has shown that everybody needs to have a stake in society. So I think the key message I would say is that how do we take this post-pandemic situation and try to rebuild societies from the bottom up, or at least from the middle out? Because I think from the top down has been tried in the United States for many years, and it hasn't worked.
Well, I think the how is a good bridge back to Athens, and I was, or Brussels, I'm not sure where you are at
Brussels,
the moment.
actually.
Brussels, okay, back to Brussels. So the question would be, if we are to take advantage of the legacy of this pandemic, to see it as an opportunity, through which institutions and would we work on a European level? Where would you see most innovation coming from? Would it be the Commission, the European Central Bank, the European Parliament, all three together? Where do you see innovation in policy coming from?
Well, I think all of them, actually. The need for innovation is crucial. I think we have seen a very big part of innovation coming from the ability of Europe to borrow jointly. What we saw last year was a remarkable innovation, one that I actually did not believe was going to happen in my lifetime, but it did actually happen. Now, I'm not entirely sure I would attribute this to the Commission. It's much more the countries that decided this, and that the Commission is just implementing it. So I think at the bottom of everything, the European Union is the country. So if the countries want something, they will make the innovation that is needed. But I think if you're fundamentally an optimist, which one has to be, there is an opportunity ahead of us to try and reform our societies to meet the big challenges, but it requires effort from everyone. I agree with Ian that the biggest challenge perhaps is climate. This is the one that will define, it's actually crucial because it is an existential crisis more than anything else. And there is a lot we can do there, but it requires efforts, including down to the individual, how we adjust our lifestyles to meet the concerns of the future, all the way down to the countries, incentives, Europe, and of course the world. We are talking about a global public good here, so you need cooperation at the global level to be able to meet that challenge. I wanted to perhaps add to one more point, and that is that we are not in a post-pandemic era. We are very much in the middle of a pandemic era. It's going to take a long time before we can declare that pandemic done. because there are parts of the world where the number of incidents are actually going up rapidly. Parts of the world that are not vaccinating, and therefore nobody is safe till everybody is safe. And that's I think it's important to reflect on the fact that the post-pandemic era is not for another 2 years, at the very least. Then just one last point on the phasing out. Now, that said, it is true that we cannot keep the measures in place that we have already today. The fiscal impulse that was given in the past year cannot be sustained for much longer. We need to think about phasing out, not exiting, but phasing out some of the measures. The biggest objective of the measures when they were taken last year was to try and provide income support and preserve people in employment. So I think this is the same principle that should guide the way that we're phasing out measures. When we are taking out the support from the companies or from individuals, it's important to try and maintain people in employment. Otherwise, the efforts that we made in the previous months might actually be wasted. So I think that would be the guiding principle, as far as I'm concerned, as we begin to phase out some of these measures.
Right, and so looking a bit on, obviously the crisis creates points of consensus, but there is also a political agenda that probably creates new divides. I'm wondering, with tools like Next Generation or SURE, are they fit to deal with post-pandemic implications? And if not, how do we begin to negotiate what is appropriate or inappropriate? I mean, who? Parties? Governments? What's your take on this?
I do believe that the Next Generation EU is a big progress in itself, and the fact that a kind of glass ceiling of the EU fiscal capacity, which was set around 1% of the GNI, is broken. This is a big thing. On the other hand, when the volume of the Next Generation EU was defined 1 year ago, it was not properly understood how deep, how long this crisis and the recession will be. So I think there should be thinking currently, especially in the Commission, of course, about potential extensions or potential additions to the possibility of the stimulus to make the recovery sustainable, and also to look at the fiscal rules. Fiscal rules have been mentioned before, and if you ask about policy innovation, I think this is indeed one of the critical questions. We are actually approaching the 30th anniversary of Maastricht, and I think the best kind of celebration of Maastricht would be a kind of thorough reform of the fiscal rules to bring them up to speed in the 21st century, clarify the debt ceiling, because it's clearly obsolete, what is written on the paper, and make also the deficit rules smarter. And you ask with whom this innovation should take place. There is now this ongoing consultation about the future of the European Union, a kind of big conference. I don't think this is a most suitable format to discuss, the nuances of the fiscal rules, but perhaps the purpose of economic governance can be discussed, among the stakeholders with the citizens. Why exactly we need shared prosperity in the European Union and balanced economic opportunities in all countries and all regions of the EU and beyond the EU, because the discussion we had yesterday about the Western Balkans perhaps also highlights that the EU has a certain responsibility not only for itself, but also some parts of the neighborhood as well.
Right, but so you would say there is a consultation process, but being from think tanks, I'm just wondering, do you feel that political parties have in Europe, or families in Europe, are taking this need for consultation to its logical conclusion, because Europe is divided between net contributors and not net contributors, countries with fiscal deficit and not fiscal deficits. We know very well the points of the consensus, but we also have differences we need to discuss. Where is the right place to discuss them? Perhaps Mr. Dreher has a view on it.
Well, I think one thing that the European Union has in common since it was established is its internal divisions. I think that in the context of this post-pandemic, and as we reach, as Maria rightly pointed out, when we finally reach the post-pandemic environment, and if we're talking, say, about the European Recovery Fund, I think the European Parliament really has a key role to play, because I think I would be relatively cautious about the European Recovery Fund. Yes, it's a great breakthrough in terms of the integration process. It certainly made a lot of economists happy who have been, arguing for something similar for many decades. But the reality is, if we get the European Recovery Fund wrong, that will significantly reduce public support for the European Union in the years ahead. And I can tell you, if the European Recovery Fund becomes a symbol for the misallocation of resources, for corruption at a national level, that will be the end of the support for further European integration in the Frugal 5 or the Frugal 6, or at that stage it might be the Frugal 12, you just don't know. So I think that's very, very, very important. And while I also think that when the Recovery Fund was introduced, it was done in the climate of we need support now. But I think what we have seen is that the Recovery Fund will be a long-term tool. The money will start coming soon, but it's not about spending all the money this year. It's a multi-annual framework for reform. And I really think our expectations should be tempered, because I think if you just look at Italy is often taken as the biggest recipient of recovery funding. I think it's going to use like 190 billion of grants and loans, right? That's great. There are many, many, many reforms that Italy needs to, and investments that Italy needs to make. But if you look at the structural funds which Italy received from 2014 to 2019, the absorption rate, or the rate at which Italy was able to absorb those funds and spend them properly was barely 40%. So we need to be very, very, very careful. And I think the European Parliament has a huge role, and I think particularly the mainstream pro-European families in the European Parliament have a huge responsibility in ensuring as best they can that these funds are going where they're supposed to go. I think that's going to be very important.
Right. Long-term planning and long-term policy making. Do we have a long-term policy cycle, or do we respond to developments in the EU? How do you feel about where policies are coming from? Do we react to things that are happening, or are we planning ahead? Because there's a feeling that other parts of the world are much better in foresight, in policy foresight.
I suspect this is addressed to me.
Yes.
It's interesting. Earlier on, Ilya, you said in one of your comments that the European Union only reforms through crisis. I actually think this is a characteristic of human nature. It's not just the European Union. But we only really do what we have to do once we've exhausted all alternatives. And I think that is also true for the EU. The EU is 27 sovereign states. There isn't one voice when it comes to many issues. So therefore, that delays the speed at which we progress. I think, if you wanted to spin the message positively, what I'd like to do is that compare the response of this crisis to the response in the previous crisis, and really you see huge differences, both in size but also in timeliness. So I think that's important. So we're learning from previous crises. So the ability to respond is progress. Now, foresight, as you're saying, is of course important. It is a lot more difficult to coordinate foresight when you're doing it with so many different countries with different necessarily objectives. I think to the extent that we understand and agree what the challenges of the future are, then we can have that necessary foresight. I think climate is perhaps the most important and most obvious example. I think there we are really coordinating our response. The EU, via the Commission, is really taking the lead in this respect. And that is done with a great deal of foresight and great reliance on science, what we learn from science. So in that respect, I think we are proactive, not just reactive. Now, we could do it on other things as well, including our economic architecture, which is very, very slow to move. But I mean, I think at least in some things we are making progress.
Making progress where you can make progress. On a political level, do you think, I mean, there's a lot invested, I think, by Mr. Dreher on the European Parliament. On a political level, do you feel there is enough discussion within political parties and with their political basis on economic policy? Because that's the one thing that is trans-European. It's not within European levels. There are pan-European political families. Do you feel there is enough engagement of the public on economic policy?
Well, probably the question implies the public is not sufficiently engaged in the economic policy making, but if the first part of the question refers to the mainstream political parties, I suppose there is a very serious analysis of the situation, and also it translates to the search for the right recovery policies, the right long-term framework. The references made to foresight. I think people very often refrain from saying planning, which I think is not at all a problematic word, but those who don't like it say structural guidance and things like this. The point is that the European Union is bound to do this. In my view, and what started 2 decades ago as the Lisbon strategy, and then continued as a Europe 2020, which is partly a macro vision, but also identifying the most important structural policies that need to generate change, and aligning this on long-term targets. Which may fail, and I think that a lot of people simply fear from not reaching a target, while the bigger problem, in my view, would be not having the ambition to generate long-term improvement in economic and social conditions in the European Union. So the Europe 2020 targets were somehow airbrushed at the time of the Juncker Commission, and now suddenly the Commission brought back a climate target, and then in the spring they brought back 3 social targets: unemployment rate, poverty reduction, and lifelong learning. So I think this kind of policy development obviously comes from partly consultations, because the general public wanted to see a stronger social dimension of the European Union. So now the Commission responded to this, and the Porto summit confirmed it from the members of the European Council that this is okay, quite important. But some kind of overarching scheme for long-term economic and social development, in my view, is still missing, because that would have the capacity to deliver a vision with which the citizens can also identify.
Would you echo the
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I don't know if there are any closing words. I don't see any questions from the right. I think you've addressed most questions here. One question I haven't seen is the cost on prejudice then of social inequality and the division of society, but I think we could have several panels on that. I'd like to thank you all. I think we had different, distinct perspectives, and I, for one, learned a lot. I hope you share this view. Thank you very much, and I'll give my place back to the host. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilya. Thank you for moderating the panel. I think that even though we have to cut it a bit short, we've heard many valuable insights that will help us drive through the road of economic recovery of the post-pandemic Europe. Thank you, the valuable guests. Thanks to the guests who connected online.